The Salt-Stained Hymnal, Chapter 6, The Cleansing Flame. The world ended at the red line. On Joric's side, the floor was bleached polymer, scoured clean by UV light and the ceaseless hum of air recyclers. The air tasted of ozone and sterility, a flavor so bland it was an act of aggression. It was the taste of the Aerie, of purity, of the carefully maintained illusion that humanity had won. On the other side of the meter-thick plasteel viewport, that illusion dissolved into a greasy, weeping reality. The Gill-Racks, a vertical slum clinging to the city's spine, forever dripping under a twilight sky of chemical smog and refracted emergency lighting. He stood before the threshold, the massive circular airlock door like a closed metal eye. Its surface was cold and impassive under his gloved fingertips. This was the part he hated most. Not the descent, not the filth, not the desperate faith-sick minds he was paid to dissect. It was the transition, the deliberate mechanical act of leaving a lie for a truth he despised. The situation has degraded. The voice, devoid of inflection, came from beside him. Commander Kaelen Rask didn't look at Joric. He stared through the viewport into the dripping dark, his posture as rigid as the support struts holding benthos together. His black Consolidation Authority uniform was a void against the sterile white of the corridor, its silver piping sharp as a blade. Everything about Kaelen was sharp. The crease of his trousers, the line of his jaw, the clipped precision of his words. Joric kept his own gaze fixed on the lock. Situations in the racks are in a permanent state of degradation, Commander. It's a design feature. The primary reclamation pump for Gamma 9 is offline. Catastrophic failure, Kaelen continued, ignoring the jibe. His voice was the flat, dispassionate drone of a machine reading a damage report. The sector is flooding with level 4 effluent. 2,000 souls in the initial inundation zone. The water is saturated with this new contaminant. The Murmuration, Joric supplied, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Every new god needed a name, something to whisper in the dark. It gave the delusion shape. It is a pathogen, Kaelen corrected, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. One that incites mass hysteria. Reports from the sector describe communal singing, cessation of work details, refusal to evacuate. They call themselves the hymners. Joric felt the familiar, bitter amusement rise in his throat. He had seen it all before. The rust prophets who saw God in the spreading corrosion on a bulkhead. The children of the filter who practiced ritual drowning. Desperation was the ultimate primordial soup, and faith was the strange, twitching life that crawled out of it. Let me guess, a charismatic leader has emerged? A prophet? Silas. The name was a clipped, ugly sound from Kaelen's lips. Former sump diver. First identified case. Now he's performing miracles. We have unconfirmed reports of mycelial networks purifying water cisterns, of fungal growth reinforcing failing structures. Kaelen finally turned his head, and his eyes, the color of cold seawater, pinned Joric to the spot. This is not a simple contagion, Cantor. It's a challenge to the authority's fundamental function. It offers an alternative to structured survivalism. It offers a hallucination, Joric countered, turning from the door to face the commander fully. A psychotropic fungus thriving in the city's rot, releasing spores that rewrite the brain's fear and despair responses with euphoric nonsense. It's not a challenge, Commander. It's a public health crisis with messianic branding. He watched Kaelen process the dismissal. The man's control was absolute, a suit of armor forged from ideology. But Joric could see the hairline cracks, the subtle tension in the muscles around his eyes. Kaelen didn't want an academic. He wanted a weapon. He wanted a priest of his own faith, the faith of order and control, to perform an exorcism. "Your mission parameters are unchanged," Kaelen said, his voice dropping a fraction of a degree colder. "You will descend into Gamma 9. You will locate this Silas. You will secure samples of the primary fungal bloom, the source. Assess its transmission vector and psychoactive profile. You will give my purity enforcers a biological signature to target for sterilization. You are a scalpel, Cantor. Find the tumor so I can cut it out." Joric almost laughed. A scalpel. Kaelen saw the city as a body, and himself as its surgeon. Any cell that didn't serve the whole was cancer. It was a brutally simple and therefore popular philosophy. And if Silas and his choir don't wish to be biopsied, then your threat assessment will be factored into my subsequent tactical response. The statement was delivered with the finality of a guillotine. There was no room for debate in Kaelen's world, only orders and outcomes. "My work requires a degree of nuance, Commander, finesse. You can't learn anything from a corpse or a crater. The belief system is just as important as the biology. To understand the disease, you have to understand why the patient wants it." "I am not interested in their desires," Kaelen bit back, stepping closer. The faint scent of recycled air and cold fury rolled off him. "I am interested in their function. They are pump jockeys, algae scrapers, filter techs. When they stop performing those duties, they stop being assets and become liabilities. This belief system of yours is a systemic rot. Your job is to tell me what kind of fungicide to use." Joric held his gaze, the professional mask of detachment firmly in place, but beneath it, resentment simmered. Men like Kaelen were the reason gods were necessary in the first place. They created voids of meaning so vast that anything, even a spore dream, would rush in to fill it. He was just the man they called to sweep up the mess. "I'll need full access to the sector schematics, unredacted, and a priority channel, open only to your office." "Done." Kaelen tapped his wrist-mounted interface. A data packet pinged silently on Joric's own device. "Your report is due in 48 hours. Exceed that, and I proceed with my own solution." "Protocol 7 Delta," Joric asked, the name of the BCA's firebombing directive, a dry taste on his tongue. "You'd incinerate an entire sector, thousands of citizens, to kill a mold?" Kaelen's eyes were chips of ice. "I would incinerate this entire city to preserve it. Do not misunderstand my meaning. You are the elegant solution. I am the final one. Do not make me choose." With that, he turned on his heel. He didn't offer a "stay dry" or any other hollow pleasantry. He simply walked away, his polished boots echoing down the white corridor, leaving Joric alone with the humming silence and the unblinking eye of the airlock. A harsh klaxon blared, once, twice. With a deep groan of stressed metal and a long drawn-out hiss of equalizing pressure, the lock began to cycle. The great wheel on its face spun, and the inner door retracted into the wall. Joric stepped into the cramped sterilization chamber. A second klaxon sounded. Chemical mist, smelling of bitter almonds, sprayed from nozzles in the ceiling, coating his exposure suit in a fine, sterile sheen. For 30 seconds, he stood in the roaring dark as the machine did its work. Then, silence. A final deep thud echoed through the floor as the outer door disengaged. It slid open, not with the sterile quiet of Aerie tech, but with a protesting shriek of metal on metal. The air hit him first, a physical wave of humidity and decay, thick and heavy in his lungs. It smelled of rust, of algae paste, of unwashed bodies, of wet concrete. And beneath it all, something else, a scent both cloying and sweet, like honey left to rot in a damp cellar. The perfume of the new god. He stepped out onto the gantry. The endless dripping symphony of the Gill-Racks enveloped him. He looked down into the chasm, a dizzying vertical maze of catwalks and makeshift homes, lit by the sickly orange glow of failing sodium lamps and the unsettling, gentle blue-green shimmer of bioluminescence that seemed to emanate from the very walls. His mission was clear. His resentment was a familiar weight. Another god to kill, another hope to dissect and label as a symbol.
Logging environmental baseline, he murmured, his voice a flat tone against the chaos. His gloved thumb tapped the side of his wrist-mounted interface. The screen, a crisp rectangle of clean orange light, bloomed to life. Numbers scrolled past, a language far more comforting than the desperate human press beyond the platform. Airborne particulates, mycoclass, 117 ppm. Unacceptable. Humidity, 99%. Saturation point. Ambient toxin profile. Ferrous oxides, ammonia, methane, all elevated. His face remained a mask of professional disinterest. This was data. This was the board on which the game was played, nothing more. He stepped out onto the catwalk. It shuddered under his weight, the grated metal slick with a perpetual greasy film. He was an antibody in a sick organism. His dark water-repellent sin coat and polished boots were an insult to the rust-stained rags and bare calloused feet of the damps who swarmed the walkways. They parted around him, a silent, resentful tide. Their eyes, wide in the dim bioluminescent glow from fungal blooms on the walls, followed the clean lines of his gear. He was authority. He was Aerie. He was everything they were not. Joric ignored their stares. His focus narrowed to the task. He unclipped a telescoping sampler from his belt, its sterile silver a stark contrast to the grime. Extending it, he scraped the tip along a weeping seam in a massive support pillar, collecting a smear of rust-colored slime teeming with microscopic life. He retracted the tool, deftly capping the sample and sliding it into a port on his wrist unit for preliminary analysis. The process was fluid, economical, a ritual he'd performed in countless other wretched hives of faith and filth. Another prophet, another plague, he thought, the words cold and precise in his mind. They call it a god. I call it an allergen with a good marketing campaign.
There, a man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, stood transfixed before a wall of pulsing, sickly green lichen. His lips moved, forming silent words, a one-sided conversation with the fungus. Glossolalia. Stage 1. Subjective auditory phenomena. Further on, a woman sat cross-legged amidst the flow of traffic, humming a haunting three-note melody over and over. Her head was tilted, as if listening to a frequency no one else could hear. Repetitive vocalization, fixation, classic whispering sickness. Joric subtly angled his wrist, and a tiny lens on the device recorded her for his report. Evidence. Data. That's all she was. They were pathetic. They clutched at this sickness, this beautiful lie, because the truth of their existence, the constant drip, the failing pumps, the slow grinding extinction, was unbearable. His family hadn't had the luxury of a beautiful lie. They had only the truth of the rising water, the crushing pressure, the darkness. He felt the ghost of that memory try to surface, a cold bubble rising from the deep, and he ruthlessly pushed it back down. Emotion was a variable he could not afford. It contaminated the results. He noticed a change in the ambient sound. It was subtle, a shift in the polyrhythmic dripping. As he passed a dark intersection of catwalks, a particularly loud syncopated drip from a corroded pipe overhead suddenly ceased. Then another, further down the path. It was the drip cant, the coded language of the damps. A silent alarm was passing through the crowd, rippling outwards from his position. The stares became less resentful and more wary, more watchful. They weren't just seeing an outsider now, they were tracking a predator. Joric felt the first flicker of unease. It wasn't fear. Fear was illogical. It was annoyance, an unknown variable, a pattern he couldn't immediately parse. His analysis of the cult relied on observing their natural behavior, and his presence was altering the experiment. He needed a better vantage point. He saw a rusted ladder leading up to a higher, less traveled maintenance gantry. He moved towards it, the crowd parting with a palpable reluctance. As he placed a foot on the first rung, a small hand tugged at the hem of his coat. He looked down. A girl no older than 7 stared up at him. Her face was smudged with grime, but her eyes were shockingly clear, intelligent, and free of the vacant bliss of the hymn nurse. She wasn't sick. She was just a child in a dying world. She reminded him of... He cut the thought off. What? His tone was sharp, devoid of warmth. The girl didn't speak. She just held out a small, crudely carved object. It was a piece of driftwood, whittled into the shape of a bird with its wings unfurled. A useless, sentimental thing. "I don't carry cals," he said, dismissing her. She shook her head, pushing the carving against his leg. Her eyes held his. There was no pleading in them, only a strange, solemn intensity. Joric felt an irrational chill, a prickling sensation at the base of his neck. He looked from her face to the wooden bird, and for a half-second the intricately carved feathers seemed to blur, to resolve into the spiraling fractal pattern of a mycelial bloom. Salt rot? He blinked, and the illusion was gone. It was just a piece of wood. He pushed past her without another word, climbing the ladder with brisk, angry movements. The unease was solidifying now, coalescing into something that felt dangerously close to a real emotion. He reached the gantry and strode to its edge, the chasm of the Gill-Racks falling away into misty, glowing darkness below. He raised his wrist, intending to run a wide-spectrum atmospheric scan. He needed to re-establish control, to bury this momentary weakness under an avalanche of hard data. "Initiating deep-level resonance scan," he commanded. The interface chirped. A wave of energy, invisible to the naked eye, pulsed downwards into the abyss. And then he heard it. It wasn't a sound that entered his ears. It was a resonance that vibrated directly in the bones of his skull. Faint, impossibly distant, a single pure melodic note that rose from the depths, holding for a breathtaking moment before being joined by another, and another, forming a chord of such sublime and sorrowful beauty that it made his teeth ache. It was a choir singing from the bottom of the sea. His blood ran cold. He ripped his gaze to his interface. The audio sensors were flat, nothing, ambient noise only. The sound wasn't real. Auditory pareidolia, his mind supplied, the clinical diagnosis feeling hollow, a desperate lie. The brain's tendency to find patterns in random noise, a symptom of stress and atmospheric pressure changes. He gripped the railing, his knuckles white. The metal was cold and wet, an anchor in a world that was suddenly tilting. Below, the greasy blue and sickly green bioluminescence of the bloom deeps pulsed in time with the phantom music, the song of the murmuration. It wasn't just in the walls or the air anymore. It was in his head, and it knew his name. The signal on Joric's wrist-mounted scanner pulsed with a sickly green light, a frantic heartbeat in the oppressive dark of the Gill-Racks. Each throb was a confirmation, a breadcrumb leading him deeper into the guts of the condemned market level. The air here was thick enough to drink, a foul cocktail of wet, rusting durasteel, the ozone tang of a nearby arcing conduit, and something else. Something new, a sweet, cloying scent that clung to the back of his throat like honeyed poison, the smell of faith. He pushed aside a heavy curtain of overlapping plastic strips slick with generations of grime and condensation. They parted with a wet, tearing sound, revealing the source of the scanner's agitation. It was a market stall, long since stripped of whatever meager goods it once sold. Its corrugated walls wept black streaks of moisture, and the floor was a slurry of mud and discarded ration wrappers. But it wasn't empty. 7 figures huddled in the center of the stall, clustered around a leaking pipe that had been draped with phosphorescent fungal blooms. The blooms pulsed with a gentle, greasy light, casting their faces in shifting shades of viridian and azure. They were damps, their clothes the typical patchwork of scavenged synthetics, but their faces were wrong. They were serene, not the hard-won calm of a survivor catching a moment's rest, but a deep, placid vacancy, an unnerving bliss that sat grotesquely upon their gaunt, malnourished features. They were murmuring. It wasn't a song, not really. It was a single, resonant tone, a low hum that vibrated in the chest. It rose and fell in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, perfectly in sync with the pulsing light of the fungus on the pipe. They swayed slightly, a human tide drawn by a non-existent moon. Joric's lip curled. He unclipped his omnicorder from his belt, the device's orange standby light a stark intrusion in the stall's holy green glow. He held it up, the lens focusing with a faint whir. His work began. File log, Gamma 9 Hymnal Alpha, he subvocalized, the quarter's mic picking up the vibration in his throat. His voice was a dry rasp, devoid of emotion. Initial contact with infected community, 7 subjects, environmental spore concentration significant. He panned the quarter across the group, cataloging them like specimens. The old man with cataracts clouding his blissed-out eyes, the woman rocking a bundle of rags as if it were a child, the 2 youths, barely old enough to work the algae vats, holding hands with a grip that was both tight and completely limp. Pathology, his mind supplied, a cool and comforting mantra. Not piety, not revelation, a simple, elegant pathogen at work. He could almost map it out in his head. The spores, inhaled, cross the blood-brain barrier. They release a bespoke psychotropic agent, a chemical cocktail designed for compliance. It suppresses frontal lobe activity, fear, anxiety, critical thought, while stimulating the pleasure centers. The result was this: a living beatitude, a neurological cage with velvet bars. Note the characteristic symptoms of early-stage infection, he continued his dictation. Mydriasis, extreme pupil dilation, auditory visual fixation on the fungal source, slackened facial musculature resulting in a placid expression. The vocalizations, the hymn, are likely an induced neurological feedback loop. The sound frequency resonates with the spore's psychoactive rhythm, deepening the trance state. It was so beautifully, clinically simple. It validated everything. This was the answer to every prayer ever uttered into the uncaring dark. Not a god, but a fungus. Not salvation, but a symptom. His own loss, the memory of his wife's hand slipping from his in the churning water, the ghost of his daughter's cry swallowed by the deluge, it was all just physics, random, brutal, and utterly meaningless. These people, huddled in their squalor, had simply found a more pleasant way to ignore that truth. It was an abdication, an act of profound cowardice. His intellectual contempt was a shield, cool and hard against the memory of grief that threatened to surface in places like this. He adjusted the omnicorder's focus, zooming in on the fungal growth itself. Pulsating, networked mycelia snaked across the pipe, their glow intensifying with each swell of the collective hum. The Godhead. Suddenly, one of the figures stirred. A young woman, no older than 20. Her head tilted on her neck with a slow, languid grace, as if moving through water. Her eyes, two vast black pools, swiveled and locked directly onto him. Joric froze. His training screamed at him to retreat, that direct engagement was a risk, but her expression held no threat. There was no recognition of him as an outsider, no fear, no curiosity. There was nothing. It was like being looked at by a beautiful, intricate machine that had just registered his presence. She smiled. It was a slow, gentle blossoming on her lips, utterly disconnected from the vacant pools of her eyes. It was the most unsettling thing he had ever seen, the smile of a corpse animated by a puppeteer's string. Her hand, thin and pale in the green light, rose. She extended it towards him, not in a plea or a threat, but an invitation, an offering. In her palm lay a small, moist nodule of the glowing fungus, pulsing in time with the one on the pipe. "Come," the gesture said. "Join us. Drown with us. It doesn't hurt." Joric stared at the offering, at the biological sacrament of this new, pathetic faith. He felt a surge of something cold and sharp. Not anger, that was an emotion too wasteful for this place. It was a profound, intellectual disgust. They weren't just dying, they were surrendering, trading the brutal truth of existence for a chemical lie, a cheap, easy peace that his family had been denied. They had fought, they had screamed, they had clung to a meaningless life until the salt-rot waters tore it from them. These people, they were just letting the tide pull them under without a fight. He didn't speak, he didn't shake his head. He simply lowered the omnicorder and pressed the end recording stud with his thumb. The click was loud, obscene in the humming silence. The orange light on the device winked out.
He gave the woman one last look, his face an impassive mask. He had what he needed: evidence, analysis, the mundane biological truth that would be the first nail in this new God's coffin. He turned his back on the woman's outstretched hand, on her empty smile, on the warm, sweet, rotting promise of her faith. He pushed back through the filthy plastic curtain, the wet strips dragging across his shoulders like a final, unwanted baptism. The sound of the hymn was immediately muted, swallowed by the groan of the city's dying bones and the steady, honest drip of contaminated water from the ceiling above. Stay dry. He pulled up his collar, the scanner on his wrist now silent. Another case, another cult, another lie. It was all so terribly simple. The chittering of the particle counter was the only validation he needed. It was a frantic digital heartbeat counting out the failure of this district in micrometers and parts per million. Joric knelt, the reinforced fabric of his suit crinkling over his knees. Before him, the source was obvious, almost insultingly so. A main water reclamation conduit, wide as a man's torso, wept a steady greasy effluence from a series of stress fractures along its rusted belly. It was an artery, severed and leaking the lifeblood of gamma-9 into the maintenance corridor. His rebreather hissed a rhythmic counterpoint to the city's deeper groan, the constant, bass-heavy thrum of the primary pumps that was Benthos's only true hymn. The air here was thick enough to taste, even through the triple charcoal filters. Ozone, wet metal, and something else, something cloyingly sweet, like nectar left to rot in the perpetual damp, the scent of the murmuration. Patient zero, Joric murmured into the quiet of his helmet, the sound deadened by the enclosed space, or ground zero, whatever the scripture calls it. His gaze traced the leak to where it pooled on the grated floor. The water wasn't just water, it was a slurry, thick with a fungal growth that pulsed with a soft, sickly viridian light. It coated the pipe and the surrounding wall in a lattice of obscene beauty, like frost on a pre-deluge window pane. Each crystalline structure a perfectly formed vector for the whispering sickness. This was it, the nexus of the local outbreak. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a sign from a new god. It was a plumbing issue. The banality was almost disappointing.
He unclipped the sampling kit from his belt. The sterile chrome of the extraction syringe and the pristine glass of the collection vials felt alien here, artifacts from a cleaner world. His world, the Aerie, a place where logic still held dominion over the rot. Here, in the Gill-Racks, logic was just another thing that corroded. His HUD flickered, painting the spore concentration in the air with a false color overlay, a toxic rainbow with the deepest, angriest reds clustered directly around the conduit. The pipe itself groaned, a low, tortured sound of metal under immense shifting pressure, a common enough sound in Benthos, the death rattle of the old world skeleton. He dismissed it. His focus was on the mission, on the data. The data was the only truth. He selected a spot where the mycelial mat was thickest, a pulsating node of pale green light that seemed to brighten and dim with the rhythm of the city's pumps. It looked like a heart, a diseased alien heart. He could feel the vibration through the soles of his boots. Another groan, longer this time, resonating up from the floor into his bones. He should have paid more attention. Just another sample, he told himself, extending the syringe. Just another lie to put in a bottle. His gloved finger depressed the plunger, drawing back the needle. He leaned in closer, the orange emergency light glinting off his faceplate. The sweet smell was overwhelming now, a physical presence that seemed to press against the seals of his mask. The green node of fungus pulsed faster, brighter. He saw in its intricate veined surface a pattern that looked almost familiar. A spiral, like a seashell, like the one his daughter Elia had kept on her bedside table. A ghost of a memory, irrelevant data. He pushed it away. He touched the tip of the needle to the gelatinous surface of the growth. The groan became a high-pitched scream of shearing metal. Joric had only a fraction of a second to look up, to see the long rusted fracture on the pipe's underbelly tear open into a gaping maw. He saw a flash of internal pressure buckling the plating outward, and then the world dissolved into a concussive roar. Salt rot!
The blast of water hit him like a solid object. It wasn't a leak anymore. It was a fire hose of putrid, spore-choked fluid erupting from the city's guts. The force lifted him off his feet and slammed him backward into the opposing concrete wall. His head connected with a sickening crack of polymer against stone. The world became a kaleidoscope of spinning lights, the angry orange of the emergency strobes, the verdant green of the fungus, and the sudden, sharp white of pure agony behind his eyes. He slid down the wall, landing hard on the grating. His ears rang with a deafening metallic tone. But worse, far worse, was the new sound, a frantic, high-pitched hissing right next to his ear, a pressure alarm. The impact had knocked his rebreather askew, breaking the hermetic seal at his jawline. Panic, cold and absolute, cut through the pain. He fumbled at his helmet with clumsy, trembling fingers. For a critical second, maybe 2, maybe 3, an eternity, he was breathing it. The raw, unfiltered air of the hot zone. It wasn't just a smell anymore, it was a taste. A thick, syrupy sweetness that coated his tongue and the back of his throat. Honey and grave dirt. He felt a strange, invasive warmth flood his lungs, spreading through his chest like a fever breaking. With a final, desperate shove, he slammed the mask back into place. The seal locked with a loud click. The rebreather's internal scrubbers whined into overdrive, trying to purge the contamination. He gasped, sucking in the clean, sterile air, but it was too late. The alien thing was already inside him. The sample had been taken, just not by him. He lay there for a long moment, the torrent from the ruptured pipe still hammering the corridor, splashing around him. His particle counter was dead, its screen a spiderweb of cracks. His sampling kit was gone, washed away into the dark. All his tools, all his clinical detachment, gone. He was no longer the investigator. He was the subject. Slowly, painfully, Joric pushed himself into a sitting position. His head throbbed in time with the city's pulse. He looked at the source of his ruin. The conduit was hemorrhaging water now, a full-bore deluge. And the fungal growth? It wasn't being washed away. It was thriving. The ruptured pipe was feeding it, nourishing it. The bioluminescent light was brighter than ever, painting the entire corridor in its ethereal, ghastly glow. It pulsed with a triumphant, living energy.
And then he saw it. In the swirling mist of atomized water and spores, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. A shape, small. The pale white of a simple dress, the kind they gave to children in the relocation shelters after the deluge. He blinked, the water on his faceplate smearing the image. When his vision cleared, it was gone. There was nothing but the gushing water and the pulsing green light. But the afterimage was burned into his mind. The impossible, undeniable shape of a little girl, standing just out of reach. Elia? The name was a ghost on his lips, a word he hadn't spoken out loud in years. It felt like a shard of glass in his throat. He was alone in the roaring dark of the corridor, but for the first time since the final deluge, he didn't feel like it. The world came back in a concussive gasp. Joric's lungs burned,
each heave a frantic effort to expel the sweet, cloying dust that coated his throat. He was on his hands and knees on a grated metal walkway, the taste of ozone and caramelized sugar thick on his tongue. A ragged coughing fit racked his body, each spasm sending a fresh wave of dizziness through him. Below the grating, unseen water gurgled and hissed. The air was a humid soup of rust, wet concrete, and that damnable honey-rot perfume of the Murmuration. Mycotoxin exposure, significant particulate inhalation, his mind catalogued, a desperate grasp for the clinical language that had always been his shield. Estimated concentration, 70 parts per million. Acute hallucinogenic effects expected within 90 seconds. The numbers were an anchor in the swirling chaos. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drum against the city's deep, metronomic pulse, the ever-present hum of the great pumps, the heartbeat. The ruptured conduit lay behind him, a gaping wound in the corroded wall of the service tunnel. Kaelen's enforcers had used a breaching charge. Morrow had shoved him and Delara through the opening, just as the pipe, fat with decades of fungal slurry, had burst. A cloud of shimmering golden-green spores had erupted, a silent, beautiful explosion. He'd thrown himself over the child, but he'd taken the blast full in the face.
"Fine," he rasped, the word tearing at his raw throat. He pushed himself up, one hand flat against the weeping, slimy wall. Filaments of sickly green bioluminescence pulsed faintly under his palm, casting the tunnel in a greasy, aquatic light. He needed to move. Ilara was up ahead with Morrow, her small form a silhouette against the gloom. He had the slate. He had the child. That was the mission now. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to clear his head. The spores were already at work. The edges of his vision softened, the faint green light bleeding into halos. The constant rhythmic dripping of condensation from the ceiling began to resolve into patterns, almost like whispers. Auditory pareidolia, a common symptom. He knew the literature. He'd written half of it. Stage 1, sensory distortion, he recited internally, a litany against the encroaching madness. Stage 2, memory bleed, emotional amplification. Stage 3, full sensory hallucination, loss of executive function. He was still in stage 1. He was in control. He took a staggering step forward, then another. His boots sloshed in the half-inch of scummy water covering the walkway. The distant gunfire faded, replaced by the roar of the ventilation system. Or was it the roar of the ocean? Salt rot. He was losing his grip faster than anticipated. He pressed his forehead against the cold, corroded metal of the tunnel wall, the chill a welcome shock. Ground yourself, Cantor. It's a chemical reaction, a pathogen hijacking your neurons. It is not real. He opened his eyes, and she was there. His breath hitched. The air caught in his chest, a knot of ice. Every protocol, every carefully constructed intellectual defense he had built over 2 decades of professional cynicism vaporized in an instant. This wasn't a symptom. This wasn't a pathogen. This was his daughter. No, the word was a silent scream in his skull. No, it's the fungus. It's mining your memory, the most potent emotional centers, your temporal lobe. It's projecting. She took a small, hesitant step forward. One of her red boots made a soft splosh in the water on the floor. The sound was quiet.
yet it echoed in the sudden ringing silence of his mind like a thunderclap. It was a physical, tangible sound. A hallucination doesn't displace water. A ghost doesn't make a splash. His analytical mind buckled, folded, and collapsed. He could smell it now. Not the fungus, not the ozone. He could smell the river mud from the banks where they used to walk. He could smell the clean, impossible scent of salt on the wind before it had turned toxic. He could smell the rain in her hair. An olfactory hallucination keyed to an auditory one, a synergistic assault on his sanity. It was perfect. It was flawlessly, cruelly, impossibly real. Her face was pale, her dark eyes wide and lost. There was no judgment in them, no ghostly accusation, only a child's profound and heartbreaking confusion. She looked as if she'd just woken from a long dream and didn't know where she was. She looked at him, her head tilted slightly and her lips parted. The sound that came out was not from his memory. It wasn't an echo of a time long past. It was here, now. A quiet, breathy sound that cut through the city's hum and the distant violence and every lie he had ever told himself about the meaningless void of existence. Whispering, "Daddy." The word wasn't a weapon. It was a key. It slid into the lock of a chamber in his soul he had bricked over and buried under mountains of bitter logic. And it turned. Grief, raw and unanesthetized, erupted from him. It was not the dull, chronic ache he lived with every day. This was the acute, searing agony of the moment it happened, as fresh and as vivid as the water streaming down her face. A sound escaped his own throat, a choked, guttural sob that was half denial, half prayer. He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched, trembling. The name was a ruin on his lips. "Lily."
"Joric, move your salt-rotted ass." Morrow's voice, sharp and real, shattered the moment like a pane of glass. "They're right behind us." The spell broke. He blinked, and the space by the coolant pipes was empty. There was nothing there but dripping water and the sickly green glow on the walls. The scent of river mud was gone, replaced once more by the all-consuming sweetness of the fungal bloom. But the image was burned onto his retinas. The sound of her voice was seared into his mind, coiled around his heart. His intellectual armor lay in shattered pieces at his feet. His composure was a memory. For the first time in 20 years, Joric Cantor, the professional debunker, was terrified. Not of the guns, not of Kaelen, not even of the fungus. He was terrified because for one perfect, soul-destroying second, he had believed. Joric stumbled backward, his heel catching on a slick of algae paste and rust. He fell hard, the impact jarring through his bones, but the pain was a distant signal from a world he'd just been ripped out of. He scrambled on his hands and knees, crab-walking away from the conduit, away from the shimmering haze of spores that still hung in the air like heat shimmer. His breath came in ragged, panicked bursts. Salt rot, salt rot, salt rot. The curse was a meaningless rhythm against the frantic drumming in his ears. He found a recess, a dark wound in the weeping concrete wall where a maintenance panel had long ago been scavenged. He wedged himself into the alcove, pressing his back against the cold, slimy surface. The constant drip from the level above struck a rusted girder nearby with a hollow metallic chime, a maddeningly steady metronome for his spiraling thoughts. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the image was already burned onto the back of his retinas. His daughter's face, not as a faded memory, but real, solid, looking up at him with an expression of placid disappointment. The scent of her,
ozone and clean rain, a smell that hadn't existed in Benthos for a century, was already being overpowered by the alcove stench of wet metal and the pervasive, cloying sweetness of the murmuration. It wasn't real. It was not real. It was a chemical, a pathogen, a highly sophisticated hallucinogen targeting the limbic system, cross-referencing memory with primal emotional triggers. He could write the report in his head right now. Pathogen class, psilocybin mimetic hybrid. Vector, airborne spore. Effects, acute, trauma-specific hallucinatory episode. Duration, approximately 18 seconds. Clinical, detached. The language of his trade, the sterile vocabulary that kept the screaming chaos of faith at bay. This was no different than debunking a weeping statue that was just cleverly hidden plumbing, or a prophet speaking in tongues who was just having a seizure. But his hands wouldn't stop shaking. His fingers, slick with condensation, felt numb. He could still feel the phantom pressure of a small hand slipping from his grasp. Her name was a forbidden word, a shard of glass he kept buried deep inside him, and the fungus had just reached in and twisted it. Duty. The word surfaced through the fog of terror. Duty was a shield. He had to report. Kaelen would be waiting. The thought of contacting the commander was both a lifeline and a terror. Admitting compromise was professional suicide. But silence was worse. It was complicity with his own fracturing mind. He raised his left wrist, the grimy screen of his interface flickering to life with a sickly orange glow. He had to try 3 times to activate the comms panel. His trembling thumb smeared grime across the glass. Finally, the connection glyph pulsed. He took a breath that tasted of mold and dread and keyed the channel. Cantor reporting, he managed, his voice a raw, tight thing he'd barely recognized as his own. The speaker on his wrist hissed with static for a moment before a voice, clipped and sharp as broken glass, cut through it. Status. Not a question, a demand. Joric swallowed, the sound loud in the enclosed space. Encountered, a high concentration spore release directly from a damaged reclamation conduit. He stared out from his hiding spot at the shimmering air near the pipe. He had to choose his words with surgical precision. Omit the content, report the symptom. The vector is more aggressive than initial intel suggested. Define aggressive. Kaelen's voice was utterly devoid of warmth, a perfect product of the Aerie's sterile logic. A potent neurotoxin, Joric said, the lie feeling both necessary and obscene. Causes immediate disorientation. Auditory and minor visual distortion. He could feel a cold sweat trickling down his spine. Minor visual distortion. It was like calling the final deluge a damp spell. Unclear of the immediate contamination zone. Assessing. There was a brief pause on the other end, filled only with the faint hum of the Aerie's perfectly filtered air. Joric imagined Kaelen in his stark white office, a sterile god looking down on a map of the city's decay. Did you secure a sample, Cantor? Negative, Commander. The burst was volatile. My priority was extraction. The excuse sounded thin even to him. Your priority is the objective. Kaelen bit back, the words like ice chips. Are you compromised? The question hung in the humid air, heavy with threat. Compromised. It wasn't a question about his health. It was a question of his utility, his purity. A compromised tool is a contaminated tool. A contaminated tool is discarded. The effects are receding. Joric lied again, pressing himself harder against the wall, as if to physically force the vision of his daughter out of his mind. Cognitive function is unimpaired. I am functional. Good, Kaelen said, the single word carrying the finality of a closing airlock. The hymners are using a cistern access point near your position to distribute what they're calling Silas's tears, purified water, a miracle. Find out how they're doing it. The Consolidation Authority does not tolerate competition in the business of survival. No more delays. Rask out. The comm channel clicked dead. Silence rushed back in, thick and suffocating. It was a silence made louder by the ceaseless drip, drip, drip of the Gill-Racks. He was alone. Utterly, completely alone. Kaelen's dismissal was more isolating than 1,000 meters of rock and steel. He was a piece of equipment sent into a toxic environment, and his handler's only concern was whether he could still perform his function before he corroded completely.
Joric let his head fall back against the weeping concrete, the rough surface scraping his neck. He didn't move. He just breathed. In, the sweet, honeyed rot. Out, a shaky, defeated sigh. He had built his entire life, his entire sanity, on a single, unwavering foundation, that the universe is empty, that hope is a disease, and that what was taken from him was a matter of meaningless physics. Water pressure, structural failure, bad luck, nothing more. But the murmuration hadn't whispered of gods or heavens. It had whispered his daughter's name. It had shown him her face. It had used his own profound loss as a key to unlock his mind. A potent neurotoxin. He repeated the words to himself, a desperate mantra in the oppressive dark. Just a neurotoxin. But for the first time since the waters closed over his world, the cold comfort of his nihilism felt like a lie. The professional facade was not just cracked, it was beginning to crumble, and he was terrified of what lay beneath. The air in the cistern chamber was thick enough to drink and just as toxic. From my perch on a corroded maintenance catwalk, I watched the congregation fester. Below me, 1,000 souls, maybe more, pressed against the rusted railings of Cistern Gamma 7, a concrete throat that held the sector's dregs. The water itself was a chemical soup, its surface a bruised rainbow of industrial runoff and algal scum. It smelled of rust, ozone from a sputtering light panel, and the sour, desperate sweat of the damps. Underneath it all, like honey stirred into poison, was the scent. Sweet, cloying, the signature of the murmuration. Salt rot. It's a textbook setup. My fingers tightened on the cold metal of my magno-binocular scope. Every cult needs a stage, and this was a good one. Grandiose, hopeless, the perfect backdrop for a manufactured miracle. The crowd was a single swaying organism, a tapestry of patched synth weaves and gaunt, upturned faces. Their collective murmur was a low tide of misery, punctuated by the hacking coughs that were the Gill-Racks' unofficial anthem. A rhythmic drip from a stalactite of rust above me kept time with the city's distant thrumming heartbeat. Plink, thrum, plink, thrum. The metronome of a slow decay.
They weren't waiting for a man. They were waiting for an answer, an escape. The BCA offered them structured survivalism, a sterile, logical, and utterly joyless existence, measured in calibrated liters. This new faith promised ecstasy. It was no contest. "The children are sick," a woman's voice cracked through the din, raw with anguish. "The rationed water, it burns their throats." Her cry was a spark. It ignited 100 other voices of despair. A man with a keloid-scarred face pointed a trembling finger at the foul water. "They give us this filth and call it mercy! We are thirsty, prophet! We are dying of thirst!" Then he moved. Silas. He didn't stride through the crowd like a savior descending from on high. He emerged from it, as if he had been a part of it all along. I tracked him with the scope, my thumb hovering over the record function. He was unremarkable. No flowing robes, no charismatic fire. Just a man in the simple gray fatigues of a sump diver, his face clean-shaven, his dark hair cut short. He was lean, but not starving. His movements were fluid, unhurried. He was the calm at the center of their storm. He placed a hand on the shoulder of the scarred man who had shouted. He leaned in, speaking too softly for my audio pickup to catch. But the effect was immediate. The man's rigid posture slackened. His shouting face crumpled, and he nodded, a tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. Silas gave his shoulder a final, firm squeeze before moving on. Classic technique. Physical contact to build rapport. Isolate the loudest dissenter and pacify them, making them an example of your calming influence. I'd seen it a dozen times in the spore dust dens and reclamation cults. But there was a precision to Silas's work that was unsettling. He walked the perimeter of the cistern, a slow, deliberate pilgrimage. He didn't speak to the crowd as a whole. He spoke to individuals, a touch here, a murmured word there. He knelt to look a small, listless child in the eye, and the girl, who looked half dead, actually managed a weak smile. He wasn't a preacher. He was a physician making his rounds in a terminal ward.
My own throat was dry. The spores were thick here. I could feel them, a faint prickle at the back of my sinuses. My job was to observe, to document the fraud, find the hidden filtration unit, the chemical agent he was about to drop into the water, the sonic device used to create mass hysteria. But as I watched him, a strange pressure built behind my eyes. For a fraction of a second, the face of the crying woman below morphed into my wife's. Her mouth formed a name. My daughter's name. I blinked hard, the image shattering like dropped grass. Salt rot. The infection was deeper than I'd thought. I keyed my wrist interface, checking my biomonitor. Spore saturation, 11%. Elevated, but within operational limits. It was just a trick of the light, a symptom, nothing more. Finally, Silas stopped. He stood at the very edge of the cistern, his back to the toxic water, facing the now silent multitude. The desperate cries had faded, replaced by an unnerving, focused attention. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the dripping had for a moment ceased. He raised his hands, palms open, not in a gesture of power, but of invitation. "You are thirsty," he said. His voice was not loud, yet it carried through the cavernous space a calm, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the damp air rather than travel through it. "The authority tells you thirst is a weakness to be managed,
a deficit to be corrected with cold calculus. They are wrong. He slowly turned his head, looking down into the shimmering, polluted water behind him. Thirst is a truth, he continued, his voice dropping slightly, drawing them in. It is a hollow space inside you, waiting to be filled. It is a question your body asks the world. And for 82 years, the world has been silent. The sky has been silent. The gods of the old world are silent. I zoomed the scope in on his face, his eyes. They were dark, placid, but as an orange emergency light swept past, I saw it. A faint internal latticework of pale green light, bioluminescence. He wasn't just a prophet of the murmuration. He was a part of it, a fully integrated terminal.
But there is a new voice, Silas said, turning back to his flock. One that has always been here, waiting in the deep places, in the rot and the dark. It does not speak in thunder or from burning bushes. It murmurs. It sings in the water, in the rust, in the marrow of your own bones. He began to walk among them again, his hands now clasped behind his back. The crowd parted for him, a human sea yielding to his passage. This is not about a God who demands your worship, he said, his voice weaving a spell of quiet reason. This is not about a prayer for a miracle. That is the old way, the broken way. This is about communion, a sharing. The murmuration does not wish to rule you. It wishes to know you and to be known. He stopped in front of the woman whose daughter he had smiled at. It feels your daughter's fever. It feels the ache in your joints. It feels your thirst. And it offers a gift, not as a reward for faith, but as a simple greeting, an answer to the question you have been asking your entire lives. The emotional shift was complete. The desperate, angry mob was gone. In its place was a congregation, their faces filled with a profound, almost painful reverence. They were hanging on his every word, their starved hope finding a new anchor. This was more dangerous than any fanatic I had ever debunked. A wild-eyed zealot is easy to dismiss. This man, with his calm logic and serene confidence, was offering them a philosophy as much as a faith. I felt a cold knot tighten in my gut. This wasn't a trick. This was a biological event, orchestrated by a man who was the willing, conscious mouthpiece of a sentient plague. Silas returned to the edge of the water. He didn't produce a vial or a device. He simply stood there in the oppressive silence and looked out over the faces of his followers. He looked at the sick children, the weary laborers, the broken families. A faint, genuine smile touched his lips. It was a smile of immense pity and of immense love. He knelt, his knees inches from the foul lip of the cistern, and reached down, not into a hidden pouch, but toward the polluted surface itself. His voice was barely more than a whisper, yet every soul in the chamber heard, "Let us drink together." The air in cistern GAM-MA9 was thick enough to drink, and just as toxic.
From his perch on a corroded maintenance gantry, Joric Cantor watched the gathering below, the beam of his headlamp cutting a dusty cone through the gloom. Below, hundreds of the faithful, the hymners, stood shoulder to shoulder on the slick concrete shore of the reservoir, a congregation of ghosts in the orange emergency lighting. Their collective breath misted in the oppressive humidity, mingling with the ozone tang of failing air scrubbers and the pervasive, stomach-turning stench of the water itself. It was a smell Joric knew intimately, the metallic bitterness of heavy metal runoff, the sour decay of algal blooms, and the fecal undertones of 80 years of desperation seeping through cracked foundations. The water was a slurry, an opaque, viscous soup of chemical refuse and biological waste, its surface shimmering with an oily rainbow film, a death sentence in a cup. And these people were here to see it turn to wine. Pathetic. He adjusted the focus on his portable spectrometer, aiming it at the crowd. His job was simple. Observe, analyze, find the trick. Every miracle had a wire, a hidden nozzle, a chemical agent. Faith was just a symptom of a pathogen or a lie, and he was the diagnostician for both. Mass delusion event, preliminary stages, anticipatory anxiety is palpable, endorphin levels likely elevated due to communal chanting. Improved conditions for a manufactured ecstatic experience. Then a ripple of silence moved through the crowd, not a command, but a shared instinctual shift. A path opened. From the darkness of a service tunnel, Silas emerged. Joric zoomed his ocular implant. The man was underwhelming. Thin, clad in the same patched gray coveralls as the rest of the damps, with no adornment save for the faint, sickly green lines that traced the veins on his neck and hands, the telltale sign of advanced infection, the murmuration's bloom visible beneath the skin. To the faithful, it was a mark of divine favor. To Joric, it was a terminal diagnosis. Silas didn't speak. He simply walked to the edge of the filth, his bare feet stopping inches from the toxic waterline. The crowd was utterly still, their faces upturned, a sea of hollow cheeks and desperate eyes illuminated in the cistern's greasy twilight. The only sounds were the metronomic drip of condensation from the cavernous ceiling and the distant, low-frequency hum of the city's water pumps, a heartbeat of benthos, faint and arrhythmic down here. With a slow, deliberate motion, Silas stepped into the water. An audible gasp went through the assembly. Joric leaned forward, his knuckles white on the safety rail. "Idiot," he breathed. The contact alone should cause severe chemical burns. Ingesting a single drop would lead to agonizing convulsions and death within the hour. He tracked the man with his scanner, waiting for the biosigns to plummet. Vitals should be spiking, skin pH crashing, but they weren't. Nothing. Silas's heart rate remained as steady as the city's groan. He waded deeper, the foul liquid swirling around his waist. He seemed oblivious to the filth clinging to his clothes, his movements serene, graceful even. He was heading for the cistern's heart, the central intake valve, a colossal rust-eaten wheel of pre-deluge steel that rose from the sludge like a pagan altar. When he reached it, he laid his hands flat against the corroded metal. Then he closed his eyes. From Silas's fingertips, glowing threads erupted, plunging into the opaque water. They weren't liquid light, They were tangible, physical structures, like the mycelial roots of some impossible fungus. They branched and spread with unnatural speed, a luminous web snaking through the darkness of the tank. Joric's jaw went slack. The network expanded exponentially, a nervous system of pure light being born in the poison. Within seconds, the entire cistern was crosshatched with a shimmering, pulsating lattice of ethereal energy. The spectacle was terrifyingly beautiful. It was an act of creation in a place of absolute decay. Joric's spectrometer shrieked a high-pitched alert. He ripped his gaze from the miracle to stare at the screen, his mind refusing to process the data streaming in. pH levels were neutralizing. Heavy metal particulates were vanishing, not settling, but being actively deconstructed at a molecular level. The readouts were a cascade of impossibilities, a flagrant violation of thermodynamics. Salt rot. How? The smell hit him next. The acrid stench of chemical waste was being systematically erased, replaced by the cloying sweet perfume of fungal blossoms. Honey and damp earth and something else, something ancient and deeply, unnervingly alien. It was the scent of the bloom deeps, the Murmuration's holy sanctum, manifesting here in the heart of the Gill-Racks. He looked back at the water. It was no longer a brown, oily soup. As the mycelial met pulsed with a final brilliant flare, the water became shockingly, impossibly clear. He could see the bottom of the cistern for the first time. The silt, the rusted debris, the bones of some long-forgotten machine, all illuminated by the gentle living light of the fungal web that had consumed the filth. The collective breath the crowd had been holding was released in a single shivering cry of pure ecstasy. Men and women fell to their knees, weeping openly, their hands outstretched toward their prophet. They weren't just seeing a miracle, they were seeing salvation. They were seeing proof that their faith could literally transform the poison of their world into life. Silas opened his eyes. For a moment, they seemed to contain the entire glowing network, 2 pinpoints of blinding green-blue light. He lowered his hands, cupping the now clear water. Without hesitation, he brought it to his lips and drank deeply.
The roar from the crowd was deafening, a wave of primal, joyous sound that shook the entire cavern, echoing the impossible truth of what they had just witnessed. Joric slowly lowered his scanner. His hand was trembling. His mind, a fortress of cold logic and empirical data, was a ruin. There was no trick. No hidden pump, no secret catalyst could do this. This wasn't a lie. This wasn't a pathogen behaving within known biological parameters. This was something else. He stared down at the radiant water, at the weeping faithful, at the silent prophet standing in the light. And for the first time since he had watched the waves take his family, Joric Cantor felt the cold, sharp terror of confronting a God that might actually be real. The air in the Aerie's command nexus was a lie. It tasted of nothing, smelled of nothing, and felt like a sterile caress against the skin. It was the perfect, calculated absence of the rot below. Commander Kaelen Rask preferred it that way. Absence was control. He stood before the primary holo display, a vast sheet of hard light suspended in the center of the circular room. Its greasy blues and sickly greens painted his severe features in alien hues. The image was a live feed from drone Epsilon 7, a silent, hovering eye above cistern Gamma 9 Delta.
Below, a crowd festered. He watched them, not as people, but as a heat map of contagion. Hundreds of damps, their faces upturned, slick with the perpetual drizzle of the Gill-Racks. They swayed, they hummed, a low choral resonance that the drone's audio filters struggled to sanitize. It sounded like static, like the death of a signal. To Kaelen, it was the sound of a tumor growing.
"He's not just a vector," Kaelen said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the quiet hum of the servers. "He's the distribution hub." He zoomed the display, the image magnifying until Silas's face filled the screen. The man's eyes were closed. He looked serene, peaceful. It was a biologically induced state of euphoria, Kaelen knew, a chemical lie to make the host more pliable. Hope was the most dangerous pathogen of all, and this man was its typhoid Mary. "Joric Cantor's last check-in was 3 hours ago," Varen reported, her fingers dancing across a touch panel. "He confirmed visual contact, but has been silent since. His vitals are stable, but his bioscanner is flagging elevated environmental contaminants." Kaelen's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped. Cantor, the theologian. A necessary tool, but an unstable one. He was meant to be the scalpel, to excise this belief with cold academic logic. But the man was mired in sentiment, haunted by a past that made him vulnerable. Kaelen had seen his file. A family lost to the deluge. A fault line in his psyche waiting to crack. "He was supposed to debunk this filth, Lieutenant, not take a bath in it," Kaelen murmured, more to himself than to her. The frustration was a cold, hard knot in his gut. This gathering, this worship, was a tactical failure. It was a breakdown in quarantine protocol. A mess. He watched Silas raise his hands. The crowd's hum deepened, a resonant frequency that made the drone's camera shimmer. They were a single organism, moving to a single unheard pulse. A hive. And hives had to be burned out. "Purity Squad Tantalus is on station at Perimeter C," Varen said, anticipating his thoughts. "Awaiting your orders." Kaelen's hand instinctively went to the comms link on his wrist. His thumb hovered over the activation stud. He could feel the order forming on his tongue. Advance. Disperse. Sanitize. The clean, satisfying crackle of incinerators. The hiss of chemical scrubbers. The reimposition of order. It would be so simple. But it would be a mistake. Force was a blunt instrument. Right now, these people were just sick, frightened, desperate. A violent crackdown would not cure them. It would transform a pathogenic outbreak into a political one. It would make Silas a martyr. It would give their beautiful, suicidal lie a power that no flame could burn away.
"Have Tantalus hold their position," he commanded, his voice tight with restraint. "Hard perimeter, no one in or out of the cistern plaza. I want every access point sealed. No cross-contamination. Is that clear?" "Crystal, Commander." He hated it. Waiting. Reacting. Structured survivalism was about proactive control, not passive containment. He felt like a physician, watching a gangrenous limb, forbidden from amputating. On the screen, Silas lowered his hands and placed them on the rust-stained rim of the cistern. The crowd fell silent. The drone's audio pickup suddenly filled with the metronomic drip, drip, drip of water, echoing in the cavernous space. For a moment, it was the only sound in the universe. "Commander," Varen's voice was suddenly sharp. "Look at the water." Kaelen leaned closer to the hollow display. The water in the massive tank was the color of rust and algae, a murky, toxic soup like every other reservoir in the Gill-Racks. But now, something was changing. From where Silas's hands rested, veins of brilliant cyan light were spreading across the surface. They branched out like frost on glass, a glowing geometric pattern of impossible beauty. A network of light bloomed in the filth. "What am I seeing?" Kaelen demanded. "Is that a chemical reaction? Some kind of bioluminescent accelerant?" "Unknown, sir," Varen replied, her voice strained. "Thermal imaging shows a rapid temperature drop. The water is purifying. Heavy particulates are flocculating and sinking. Spore counts within the cistern are plummeting. Sir, the water is becoming potable." His blood ran cold. This wasn't a sermon. This wasn't a communal hymn. This was a logistical attack. The Benthos Consolidation Authority held power through one singular truth. Only they could provide pure water. That monopoly was the bedrock of their entire civilization, and this thing was demonstrating it could do the same, for free, as a gift. A collective gasp rose from the crowd on the screen, then a roar. It wasn't the sound of a mob anymore. It was the sound of a congregation witnessing a miracle. A man dipped a cupped hand into the now glowing water and drank, his face erupting in a beatific smile. Others followed, weeping, laughing, splashing the clean water on their faces.
Kaelen felt a surge of cold fury. It was a trick, a biological sleight of hand. The fungus was secreting a coagulant, a purifying agent. It was a clever, adaptive trait designed to win the loyalty of a desperate host population. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. He saw Joric Cantor on the edge of the crowd, staring, his face a mask of disbelief, frozen, useless. The scalpel had failed. It was time for the cauterizer. "Lieutenant," Kaelen said, his voice dangerously calm, "get me Captain Ava Rostova of the Purity Corps, now." "Sir?" "You have your orders." He turned away from the screen, unable to watch the ecstatic celebration any longer. The image of the glowing, purified water was burned into his retinas. It wasn't a symbol of hope. It was a declaration of war. He walked to the viewport, a thick pane of pre-deluge glass that looked down from the Aerie. Below, the Gill-Racks were a chaotic tapestry of emergency lights and shifting shadows, shrouded in chemical smog. A diseased body. He had tried containment. He had tried a targeted intellectual cure through Cantor. Both had failed. Now the infection was offering an alternative to the system itself. And a system, any system, only has one response to that kind of threat. "A purge," he breathed, his breath fogging a small circle on the cold glass. The city groaned below him, a deep structural sigh. It sounded like a patient in its final throes. He would not let it die of this fever. He would burn the fever out. The air in the cavernous cistern chamber was thick enough to drink, heavy with the ozone tang of failing arc lamps and the pervasive sweet rot of the murmuration. From his perch on a corroded maintenance catwalk 80 feet above the floor, Joric Cantor watched the proceedings with a familiar metallic taste in his mouth. Below, a sea of upturned faces, pale and gaunt in the sickly green glow of the fungal broom spotting the weeping concrete walls. They were damps, hundreds of them, their ragged clothes perpetually slick with the city's weeping condensation. His ocular implant was on full magnification, the crosshairs centered on the man at the water's edge, Silas, the prophet. He stood barefoot in the brown, oily sludge that lapped the cistern's shore, his back to the crowd, arms outstretched as if to embrace the colossal tank of filth before him. A low, monotonous hum rose from the gathered flock, a wordless hymn that vibrated through the grated floor of the catwalk and up into Joric's bones. It was the sound of hope, and to Joric,
It was the sound of a terminal diagnosis. "Pathogenic resonance focalization," Joric murmured, his voice a dry rasp for his own benefit. His fingers tapped against the recording slate clipped to his belt. "Inducing a mild euphoric state in subjects already primed by spore inhalation and extreme deprivation. Classic manipulation. The miracle will be a chemical agent, most likely a fast-acting flocculant dropped from a hidden dispenser." He scanned the dripping ceiling, the massive support pillars. Nothing. Cunning. The cistern itself was a relic, a pre-deluge reservoir, half a city block wide. Its contents were the accumulated runoff and refuse of the Gamma-9 sector for the last 50 years, a thick, stagnant soup of chemical slurry, gray water, and God knows what else. The smell alone was an assault. Yet the crowd stared at it with the reverence of pilgrims at a holy spring. Silas lowered his hands. The humming of the crowd deepened, solidified. He dipped his fingers into the repulsive water. Joric leaned forward against the railing, the rusted metal cold and gritty beneath his palms. This was it, the parlor trick. But there was no fizz, no sudden discoloration spreading from Silas's touch. Instead, a light began to bloom from within the water itself. It started as a faint, web-like tracery, the very mycelial filaments Joric had identified in his initial samples, but now they were pulsing, a soft, ghostly green at first, the color of decay. Joric's implant automatically adjusted for the new light source, feeding him spectral analysis data he ignored. He knew what it was. What he didn't know was how.
The threads of light spread, a neural network igniting in the depths. They connected, grew brighter, shifting from sickly green to a vibrant, compossible blue. A blue like the pre-deluge sky he'd only ever seen on corrupted data slates. The humming of the crowd faltered, replaced by a collective, awestruck gasp. The light swelled, and with it came a sound, not a noise heard with the ears, but a feeling, a clean, crystalline frequency that seemed to vibrate the water in his own cells. It was the antithesis of the city's grinding, groaning heartbeat. "Salt rot," Joric breathed, the curse empty, inadequate. His mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. Bioluminescence triggered by a specific frequency? A massive bio-battery discharging? The explanations were hollow, technical jargon thrown against a phenomenon that felt ancient, elemental. Then the water began to move. It did not churn or bubble. It folded. With a silent, deliberate grace, the surface of the water seemed to fold in on itself. Joric watched, mesmerized, as decades of filth, the greasy slicks, the islands of algae, the suspended particulates of rust and waste began to draw together. They didn't dissolve. They coagulated, pulled into writhing, dark masses like living cloths of shadow. The process was terrifyingly organic. It looked like the water was healing itself, rejecting a poison it had carried for nearly a century. One by one, the dark clumps of compacted filth grew heavy, lost their buoyancy, and sank. They dropped through the now luminous blue water like stones, leaving behind a clarity so absolute it was disorienting. Within 90 seconds, the entire cistern, millions of calibrated liters, had been transformed. The water was now pristine, glowing with a soft internal light, the sunken mountains of black sludge visible on the bottom like a sleeping, vanquished evil. A single sob cut through the stunned silence from below. It was a sound of unbearable relief, then another,
Then a woman's shriek, not of terror, but of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. And then the dam of disbelief broke, and a roar erupted from the crowd. It was a physical force, a wave of sound that washed over Joric, primal and overwhelming. They surged forward, a tide of humanity breaking against the shore of their salvation. They fell to their knees in the shallows, scooping the glowing water into their hands, their mouths. They drank with a desperate, gulping thirst that spoke of a lifetime of rationing and impurity. They laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the vast chamber. They wept, splashing the water on their faces, washing away the grime of the Gill-Racks with their own tears. "It's pure! He cleansed it! The hin is answered!" Joric stood frozen, his knuckles white on the railing. His mind, his greatest tool, his only sanctuary, was a static-filled void. Every logical pathway was a dead end. Flocculent, nanites, mass hypnosis, hologram. Each word was a meaningless shield against the truth he was witnessing. The scale of it, the efficiency, the impossible energy conversion. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a localized anomaly. This was a fundamental reordering of physics enacted by a fungus. A cold dread, far deeper and chilling than the ever-present damp, seeped into him. The murmuration wasn't just a pathogen that made people see things, that made them feel good as it ate their brains. That was a horror he could understand, categorize, and fight. This was different. The thing in that water had perceived a problem, impurity, and had enacted a solution. A complex, multi-stage solution across a massive area. It hadn't been a reaction. It had been an act. It was intelligent. The realization hit him not as a thought, but as a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. His life's work, his entire cynical worldview, was built on the premise that the universe was chaotic and meaningless, that faith was a symptom of a sick mind seeking patterns in the static. He was the high priest of that bleak religion, and he had just witnessed a miracle. He stared down at the joyful, drinking masses. He no longer saw them as victims. He saw them as converts, the first citizens of a new and terrifying kingdom. He leaned over the railing, looking past the worshippers to his own reflection in the impossibly clear water below. He saw his strained, pale face staring back, and for a fraction of a second, shimmering next to his own image, he saw another, smaller, a girl with his eyes, her hair floating as if she were underwater, her mouth open in a silent O-shaped gasp. Leah. Joric jerked back from the railing, a choked sound escaping his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was a hallucination, just the spores. It had to be. But as the joyous, terrifying roar of the saved echoed up from below, the line between the sickness in his blood and the God in the water blurred into nothing. He was no longer an observer. He was part of the experiment. The air on the walkway was wrong. It was clean, sacrilegiously clean. The usual ozone tang of failing scrubbers and the acrid bite of rust were gone, washed away by an impossible wave of humidity that smelled of petrichor and honeydew melon, a scent of life where none should be. Below Joric, in the immense basin of Cistern Gamma-9 Delta, the water shimmered. It wasn't the usual murky, nutrient-paced brown. It was clear, and from its depths a soft, cerulean light pulsed in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, illuminating the ecstatic faces of the assembled damps. They were weeping, laughing, reaching their hands into the purified water as if touching a ghost. From the central reclamation valve, a lattice of mycelium had bloomed, intricate as cathedral lace and glowing with the same internal, holy light. It was a cancerous blossom that had, against all laws of biology and physics, filtered millions of calibrated liters in a matter of minutes. A miracle. Joric's mind, a fortress built of cynicism and procedure, was crumbling. The spore burst from the prophet Silas had been a psychic detonation. It wasn't just the swirling fractals or the auditory distortions he was trained to expect. It was Lily. Her face, not as a memory faded by decades of grief, but there, an inch from his own, rendered in impossible, hyper-realistic detail. He could smell the synth cotton of her small tunic, feel the phantom weight of her hand in his. She had whispered a single word, a name he hadn't allowed himself to think in 82 years. Papa. The memory, the hallucination, whatever it was, still burned behind his eyes, a chemical scorch on his soul. He touched his cheek. The grimy film of condensation there was mingled with the salt of tears he hadn't realized he'd shed. Pathogen, his training screamed. Potent, Class A hallucinogen, targeting limbic system trauma. A defense mechanism. A trick. But it hadn't felt like a trick. It had felt like a key turning in a lock he'd forgotten existed.
A burst of static tore through the air, sharp and violent. His comm unit, embedded behind his ear, crackled to life. It was like a drill bit to the skull. Static crackle. Cantor, respond. What is your sit rep? We're reading a massive bioluminescent spike and total signal chaos in your sector. Talk to me, Joric. Commander Kaelen Rask, the voice of the Aerie, a voice made of sterile polymer and recycled air, a voice that had never known the clinging damp of the Gill-Racks. Joric squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the clinical detachment back into place. He keyed his comm, his thumb feeling clumsy and distant. Rask, he managed, his own voice a dry rasp. I'm here. Report, Kaelen snapped. No greeting, no preamble, only the demand for data. Joric took a breath, the sweet fungal air filling his lungs. There's been an event. The prophet, Silas, he initiated a cascade. Mycelial network bloomed from the cistern's primary valve. It's purifying the water. Purity readings must be off the charts. It's a mass conversion event, Kaelen. Hundreds of them. Silence on the other end, thick with disdain. When Kaelen spoke again, his tone was dismissive, condescending. A coincidental bloom, Cantor. A pocket of reactive agents in the sludge, hitting a pocket of spores. You're describing a chemical reaction, not a sermon. I need the prophet's location for the purity detail. Transmit coordinates and prepare for immediate exfiltration. That's an order. Joric stared at the impossible sight below, the sheer directed intelligence of it, the way the fungal lacework avoided corroded structural points and reinforced weaker ones. This wasn't a random bloom. It was architecture. It was intent. It's not coincidental, Joric said, his voice harder now. The growth is structured, deliberate, and the spore concentration is beyond anything on record. The psychotropic effects are... He trailed off, stopping himself from saying, "It showed me my daughter." The effects are making you sentimental, theologian. You were sent to debunk, not to convert. Your assessment is compromised. I'm scrubbing the mission. A purity enforcer squad is 10 minutes out.
They have orders to sterilize the entire cistern with flame. If you are still there when they arrive, you will be considered part of the contamination. Do you understand me, Joric? Sterilize. Flame. The words were so clean, so final. Kaelen would incinerate the miracle and the hopeful, weeping people along with it. He would cauterize this outbreak of faith and call it a victory for structured survivalism. Joric looked down at the faces of the damps. He saw a man pour the glowing water over the eyes of a blind woman. He saw a mother weeping as she gave her child a drink of something other than algae-flavored sludge for the first time in its life. He saw hope, that most dangerous and taboo of all emotions, the pathogen he'd built his life on eradicating. And in their faces he saw the ghost of his own. Lily. Her face. The spores had shown him his deepest wound. Was it a weapon to disable him? Or was it a message? An invitation? The central conflict of his life was no longer an abstract philosophy debated in the sterile towers of the Aerie. It was here, now, glowing in a cistern full of poison made pure. To go back was to accept Kaelen's sterile report, to label the vision of his daughter a symptom of a disease, to file away this terrifying, beautiful anomaly as a footnote in the slow, meaningless decay of benthos. To go back was to let them burn it all and pretend it never happened. To go back was to lose her a second time. Cantor, acknowledge the order. I am not repeating myself again. Transmit your coordinates and fall back, now! Kaelen's voice was distorted with fury, a digital god screaming from a failing heaven. Joric's hand was steady as he raised it to his ear. The groaning of the city's metal bones, the hum of the distant heartbeat, the soft hymns of the people below, it all seemed to coalesce into a single, resonant frequency. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the cold peace of a man stepping off a ledge. He had spent his life running from the possibility of a truth he couldn't dissect. Now he was running toward it. His fear of discovering a real God had been his shield, but a new fear had replaced it, the fear of walking away from this and never knowing. He keyed the calm one last time. His voice was quiet, devoid of anger or fear. It was the voice of a man making a choice that would unmake him. No.
He didn't wait for the explosion of rage he knew would follow. With a deliberate press of his thumb, he deactivated the comm unit. The angry static cut out, plunging him into a sudden, profound silence. The invisible line connecting him to the BCA, to his contract, to his entire life's work, was severed. He was untethered, a ghost in the machine. He stood there for a long moment, the clean, sweet air on his face feeling like a final baptism. Below, the blue light pulsed. He was a heretic, a fugitive, possibly a madman talking to ghosts. But he was no longer an observer. He turned his back on the stairwell that led up, toward the Aerie and its sterile lies. He faced the deeper dark of the Gill-Racks, the endless dripping maze that spiraled down into the city's drowned heart, down toward the source of the bloom, down toward whatever had known his daughter's name. The fabric of the BCA jacket was a slick, water-repellent polymer, a relic from another life. Joric ripped the insignia, a stylized gear holding a single, pure drop of water, from the sleeve. The sound of tearing synth cloth was shockingly loud in the narrow maintenance conduit. It was the only sound besides the rhythmic plink, plink, plonk of condensation dripping from a corroded pipe into a puddle of iridescent filth. One life ending, another beginning. Defiance felt like a hot coal in his chest. Kaelen could broadcast Thorne's murder to every corner of Benthos, brand him a heretic, a terrorist. It didn't matter. All that mattered was the weight of the encrypted slate in his pack and the ghost image of Ilara's terrified face. He balled up the jacket and shoved it deep into a recess behind a junction box thick with greasy grime, along with his official comms unit and sidearm. They were anchors to a world that no longer wanted him, a world he no longer wanted. He was no longer forensic theologian Cantor, an agent of structured survivalism. He was just a man, a fugitive, another piece of jetsam in the drowned city. For the first time since the raid, the hot coal of defiance cooled, leaving behind the cold, heavy ash of dread. Taking a breath that tasted of rust and ozone, he pushed aside a flap of stiff, mold-caked rubber and stepped out into the market.
It was an assault, a complete sensory overload that made the sterile corridors of the Aerie feel like a half-remembered dream. The sump market wasn't a place, it was a living organism, crammed into a cavernous structural space between the Gill-Racks' lower pylons. A perpetual twilight reigned, pierced by the sputtering orange of emergency lights, the greasy green glow of fungal lanterns cultivated in jars, and the cold blue shimmer of bioluminescent lichen that crawled across every surface like a star chart of some alien galaxy. The air was thick enough to chew, a layered miasma of frying algae paste, unwashed bodies, the sweet rot perfume of murmuration blossoms, and the acrid tang of whatever passed for alcohol in this part of the city. The city's heartbeat, the low-frequency hum of the great pumps, was a physical vibration in his bones here, a constant reminder of the crushing weight of water and steel all around him. He tried to apply his old logic, his Aerie-honed analytics, scan for patterns, identify the power brokers, isolate the objective. But here, there were no patterns, only chaos. Throngs of damps and sump-tainted pushed past him, their faces etched with a hardness he'd only ever observed through reinforced glass. Zip-line harnesses screeched overhead as scavengers moved between levels. The drip cant was everywhere, a percussive secret language tapped out on railings and support struts, a code he couldn't begin to crack. His intellect, the sharpest tool in his arsenal, was useless. He was an open book written in a language no one here could read, his posture too straight, his movements too deliberate. He was prey. The need for a guide, a sump diver, was a burning imperative. Ilara and Mora were hidden in a sub-level utility closet a dozen catwalks away, but they couldn't stay there. They had to go down, down into the Bloom deeps, to the source. And for that, he needed someone who knew the way. He spotted a stall cobbled together from rusted deck plating, where a man with a face like a wrinkled boot was selling refurbished breather masks. The filters were probably just stuffed with charcoal and hope. Joric forced himself to adopt a casual stance, leaning against a damp pillar. "Looking for passage?" he said, his voice sounding hollow and formal to his own ears. "Downways." The man didn't even look up from the valve he was polishing with a dirty rag. Passage is a pipe dream, friend. The elevators are BCA stamped or they're coffins. Stay dry." "I'm not looking for an elevator," Joric pressed, trying to keep the desperation out of his tone. "I need a guide, a sump diver." Finally, the man looked up. His eyes were milky, one of them clouded over with a cataract. He gave Joric a slow, insolent appraisal, taking in his relatively clean clothes, the way he flinched when a drip of black water landed on his shoulder. A smirk played on his lips. "Ha! A sump diver! You? You look like you'd get lost on the way to your own latrine. What's a pureblood like you want in the soup? Got a death wish?" "I can pay," Joric said, his hand hovering near the pouch where he kept his emergency cows. "Oh, I bet you can," the vendor rasped. "Let me guess, you'll pay in promises and airy platitudes? Get lost, before you attract the wrong kind of attention. Or the right kind for someone like me." The dismissal was absolute. A wave of cold washed over Joric. He wasn't just an outsider, he was a resource to be stripped. He backed away, melting into the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. His defiance was gone, replaced by a raw, gnawing vulnerability. He was a child in a forest of monsters. He spent what felt like an hour just watching, forcing himself to unlearn a lifetime of Aerie conditioning. He watched the transactions, not just of cows, but of favors, threats, and information. He saw how a flicker of the eyes, a certain way of tapping a cup of nutrient paste, could convey more than a shouted sentence. This was a world of instinct, of reading the rot and the rust and the desperation in a person's soul. A world he was completely unequipped for. His gaze eventually settled on a figure leaning against the railing of a high catwalk overlooking the market's central chasm. It was a woman, wiry and coiled with a predatory stillness. She wasn't selling anything, she was just watching, her face half hidden by the shadow of a hood. Her gear was practical, patched and stained. A rebreather hung loose around her neck, and coils of fibrous rope were clipped to her belt next to a wicked-looking salvage hook. She had the air of someone who had been to the bottom and clawed her way back up, more than once. Joric knew this was it, one more chance. He navigated the treacherous swaying catwalks, the chasm below breathing a cold, damp wind that smelled of deep water and decay. He stopped a few feet from her, not wanting to crowd her space. She didn't turn, but her voice was sharp, cutting through the market din. "Whatever they're paying you to follow me, I'll pay double for the name." "I'm not following you," Joric said, his voice steady this time. He had to get this right. "And no one is paying me." She finally turned her head, and he saw her face. Young, younger than he'd thought, but her eyes were ancient. They were the color of the smog-choked sky, and they missed nothing. Scars, like faint white tributaries, mapped one side of her face. "Then you're a fool. Or a ghost," she said flatly. "State your business or take a step back." Joric took a steadying breath. No more questions about guides or passage. He had to speak her language. "I need to get to the Bloom Deeps, not to sightsee. I need to get to the heart of it. I'm told there are people who aren't afraid of the whispering sickness, people who can navigate the sunken towers." She studied him for a long, silent moment. Her gaze was so intense it felt like a physical pressure, stripping away his pretenses, seeing the frantic desperation he was trying so hard to conceal. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not pity, but perhaps recognition, the look of one doomed soul acknowledging another. "Afraid doesn't cover it," she said, her voice dropping to a low murmur. "You don't fear the deeps. You respect them, or they eat you. What you're asking for costs more than cows. It costs everything else, too." "I'm aware," Joric said. The lie tasted like ash, but it was all he had. She gave a short, sharp nod, a decision made. "Third pylon from the cascade vent. There's a maintenance elevator, cage frame, rusted to hell. Be there when the lower pump cycles. Bring the girl and the other one. Come alone, and bring every cow you have." She turned back to face the chasm. "My name is Morrow, and if you're slow or if you bring trouble, I'll leave you for the bloomed." The dismissal was just as absolute as the vendors, but this time it held a sliver of hope, a terrifying, razor-thin shard of it. He was no longer a theologian, he was just a client, and he was about to put his life, and Ilaris, in the hands of a stranger who called the abyss her home. The directions were less a map and more a series of sensory cues. Follow the low-frequency thrum of auxiliary pump station 7 Delta until it vibrates in your teeth. Then take the catwalk that smells of ozone and rust until you hear the hiss. Joric followed them religiously, each step taking him further from the structured, sterile logic of the Aerie and deeper into the damp, decaying viscera of the Gill-Racks. The workshop was a cancerous growth on the side of the pump station, a jury-rigged cage of scavenged plating and mesh welded directly to the weeping concrete wall. The hiss was a plasma torch, its brilliant blue-white arc spitting violently within, casting twitching, monstrous shadows against a grimy polymer window. The air here was thick, a greasy cocktail of hot metal, the sweet rot of distant fungal blooms, and the mineral tang of recycled water. He could feel the station's heartbeat, not just in his teeth, but in the marrow of his bones. He hesitated at the threshold, a simple pressure hatch propped open with a rusted pipe. Inside was a world he analyzed but did not comprehend. This was not a laboratory. It was a nest, a den, a place of pure function carved from the city's corpse. His hand, resting on the cold, slimy metal of the hatch frame, looked alien, too clean, the nails too perfect. This is a mistake, the clinical part of his mind insisted. A professional debunker doesn't hire a scavenger from a rumor mill. But the other part, the new part haunted by his daughter's impossible smile in a cloud of spores, knew he had no other choice. Kaelen's way was fire and fury. Thorn's was an academic curiosity that bordered on worship. He needed a third path, a path down. He stepped inside. The hiss of the torch stopped abruptly. The blinding blue-white light vanished, and the world resolved into the dim, sickly orange of emergency lighting. The sudden quiet was deafening, broken only by the city's deep hum and the relentless metronomic drip of condensation into a bucket somewhere in the darkness.
A figure rose from a crouch behind a dissected water pump. It was a woman, lean and wiry, her movements economical and sharp. She wore stained coveralls and heavy, scuffed boots. Goggles were pushed up on a forehead streaked with grease, and a rebreather hung from her neck like a tribal amulet. She pulled off a heavy welding glove, her bare hand calloused and scarred. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, raked over him once, a complete, dismissive inventory, from his 2 new boots to the anxious set of his jaw. Lost? Pure blood? Her voice was a low rasp, a sound grated smooth by bad air and cynicism. The charity kitchens are 3 levels up, and they don't take kindly to tourists. Joric felt his posture stiffen, the old Aerie arrogance a reflex he couldn't suppress. "I'm looking for Moreau Cade." The woman picked up a wrench, wiping it on an already filthy rag. She didn't confirm or deny. "Who's asking?" "My name is Joric Contour." He paused, expecting the name to carry weight. It didn't. Her expression remained one of flat, weary amusement. "I was told you were the best sump diver in Benthos." She gave a short, sharp exhalation that might have been a laugh. "The best just means the one who hasn't been eaten or bloomed yet. Doesn't mean I'm stupid." She gestured with the wrench at the scavenged pump, its guts a tangle of corroded pipes and crystal-furred valves. "This is my work.
stripping old-world miracles for parts to keep the new world from drowning in its own filth. What I don't do, she took a step closer, the orange light carving deep shadows into her face, is babysit Aerie officials on field trips to see the pretty lights in the deeps. Her gaze was unnerving. He felt transparent, his motives stripped bare as easily as the pump before her. The smell of her workshop, oil, sweat, metal, was overwhelming. A primal smell. The smell of survival. "This isn't a field trip," Joric said, his voice tighter than he intended. "It's a matter of city security. I need a guide into the Bloom Deeps."
City security. She repeated the words slowly, tasting them. Right. Is that what the BCA is calling it when one of their own goes chasing spore dreams? You've got the look, the 1,000-meter stare. Saw it in a reclamation tech last month, right before he walked off a catwalk singing hymns to the drip patterns. Salt rot. You reek of the Aerie. Filtered air, clean water. You wouldn't last 10 minutes below the sump line. The air would kill you before the Bloom'd even noticed you. His clinical detachment was a shattered wall. She saw not a forensic theologian, but another potential victim, another ghost in the making. Desperation clawed at his throat. "I'm prepared," he lied, patting the pack on his back. It was full of sample kits, a data slate, and sensors. Tools for a lab, not a tomb. "Prepared," she scoffed. "With what? Theories? Data slates? Down there, the only thing that matters is the meter on your filter, the integrity of your suit, and the weight of your pry bar." She pointed the wrench at his chest. "You're a liability. You're trouble." He had to change tactics. Authority had failed, logic was useless. He was left with the one currency that flowed even in the deepest parts of the city. "I will pay 500 cals." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the first flicker of something other than contempt. 500 cals was a fortune, a year's water ration for a family. But she didn't bite. "A lot of cals to go look at glowing fungus," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "The price of a life is higher than that, especially mine. Why, Joric Cantor, from the clean, quiet Aerie, do you really want to go diving in the Merc's cradle?" His mind raced. He couldn't tell her about the Murmuration's sentience, about Silas, about the vision of his daughter. She'd think he was already a sporehead and throw him out. Or worse. "I'm tracking a contaminant, a new biological agent. Its point of origin is somewhere in the Bloom Deeps. It's vital for the city's health that I retrieve a core sample." Morrow watched him, her head tilted. A predator assessing unfamiliar prey. "A contaminant," she mused. "You mean the whispering sickness, the divine plague. You call it a disease. The hymners call it a god. I call it a damn good reason to stay in the Gill-Racks." She took another step, closing the distance between them. He could see the intricate web of fine lines around her eyes. "The BCA doesn't send researchers on solo missions to the deeps. They send fire teams, cleansers. So you're not official, which means you're either a fool, a fanatic, or you're running from something." Joric's composure finally broke. The sterile confidence he wore like a uniform evaporated in the workshop's oppressive humidity. He was just a man, out of his depth and haunted by ghosts. A man who needed to get down there before the visions consumed him entirely. "All right," he said,
his voice low and raw. "I'm not official. Not anymore. And I am running from something. But I'm also running to something. An answer. That's all." He activated his wrist interface. The screen lit up, displaying his cal balance. 1,000 cals. Half now, half on return. He had never felt so exposed. He was laying his desperation on her workbench, next to the corroded gears and stripped wires. An offering. Morrow stared at the glowing numbers on his wrist, then back at his face. For a long moment, the only sound was the dripping water, a steady, indifferent clock counting down the seconds of his life. He saw the calculation in her eyes, weighing the cals against the risk, weighing his desperation against his incompetence. Finally, she turned away from him and placed the wrench back on the workbench with a decisive clang. "The sump gate, Sector 9, Sub-Level 4, 0400, she said, her back to him. "Come alone, no BCA friends. And for salt's sake, get a real rebreather. That sterile piece of Aerie trash on your belt will get you bloomed before we pass the first drowned skyscraper." She didn't wait for a reply. She picked up the plasma torch, and with a loud hiss, the blinding blue-white arc erupted once more, plunging Joric back into shadow. The deal was done. He turned and walked out. The image of the torch's cleansing flame burned into his retinas. The workshop smelled of ozone and wet rust, a sharp, sterile tang that failed to mask the sweet, underlying scent of decay seeping up through the grated floor. Honey and rot, the hymn of the lower levels. Every surface was slick with a film of greasy condensation, reflecting the stuttering blue arc of a plasma cutter. The woman, Morrow, didn't look at Joric. Her attention was fixed on the severed tentacle of a reclamation drone, its complex ganglia exposed like a nest of pearlescent worms. Sparks showered the damp concrete as she worked, her movements economical and precise. The only other sounds were the metronomic drip of water into a half-full cistern and the deep, resonant groan of benthos itself, the constant strain of a city trying not to drown. Joric's throat was dry, his Aerie-spun jacket feeling absurdly clean and loud in the oppressive quiet. He had been standing here for 5 minutes. He cleared his throat. "I was told you were the best," he began, his voice sounding thin against the city's heartbeat, "that you know the submerged sectors better than anyone." Morrow didn't stop her work. The plasma cutter hissed, then died, plunging the workshop into the dim orange glow of a single emergency lamp. She lifted her welding mask, revealing a face etched with the hard lines of a life lived in perpetual twilight. Her eyes, pale and startlingly direct, finally met his. They held no curiosity, only a flat, weary appraisal. "The best at what?" Her voice was gravelly, a low rasp that seemed scraped from the corroded walls around them. "Salt rot? An Aerie tourist?" She tossed the rag onto a pile of scrap. "The answer's no. Go back to your filtered air before you catch the whispers and start singing to the walls." She turned her back on him, dismissing him as completely as if he'd been a roach. The insult stung, but it was the casual accuracy that twisted the knife. He was a tourist here, an invader, and he was hearing whispers. "I'll pay," Joric said, his voice tight. "Whatever your rate is, I'll triple it." "My rate for a sump dive is high," she said without turning. My rate for a suicide run into the heart of a bloom doesn't exist because I'm not an idiot. Desperation was a current, pulling him under. He unsealed the cuff of his jacket, activating his wrist interface. The screen cast a cool numeric light on his pale skin. "Look," he insisted. "Just look." With an exaggerated, irritated sigh, she turned. Her eyes fell on the glowing display. Joric had authorized the transfer of 50,000 calibrated liters. An obscene sum. Enough water to buy a private hab in the upper Gill-Racks for a decade. Enough to buy passage to the Aerie, if such a thing could even be bought. He saw the flicker, a momentary widening of her eyes, a subtle tightening of her jaw, the raw animal calculus of survival. She stepped closer, her own battered interface flaring to life as she scanned his offer, verifying the escrow. The digits confirmed. The money was real. For a long moment, she just stared at the numbers, the orange light glinting off the metal studs on her worn leather vest. He could almost hear the gears turning in her head, weighing a lifetime of caution against a flood of pure liquid wealth. Finally, she looked up from the screen, and the hope in Joric's chest withered. The brief spark of avarice in her eyes was gone, replaced by an even colder, more profound skepticism. 50,000 cows, she said slowly, tasting the words. For that much, you're not just looking for a tour. You're either running from the BCA, or you're a sporehead chasing a vision. Which is it? Neither, Joric said, the lie feeling thin and brittle. Bullshit. She gestured vaguely downwards with her chin, towards the grated floor and the darkness beneath. Nobody goes into a fresh bloom on purpose. Not sump divers, not Hymners, not even the BCA's purity squads. The spore count in Gamma-9 right now would turn your brain to soup in an hour. Structures are collapsing by the minute, and the things that grow down there now, the bloomed, they aren't people anymore. They're just parts of the song. So I ask again, who wants you dead so bad you think running down is a good idea? He had no good answer. The logic was sound. His mission, viewed from the outside, was pure madness. Money wasn't enough. He had to give her something else, the truth, or a piece of it so insane it might just pass for one. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The clinical mask he'd worn for years felt like it was cracking. "You're right," he said, his voice dropping, becoming raw. "It's suicide. I know that." He met her gaze, letting her see the manic intensity he'd been trying to hide. The haunting. "But you've got the mission profile wrong. I'm not asking you to help me run from it." He took a step closer, the sweet smell of the murmuration seeming to intensify, coiling around them. "I'm not asking you to stop it. I'm not trying to salvage some old-world tech. I'm asking you to take me to its heart, to the source." The air in the workshop seemed to thicken. Morrow, for the first time, looked completely still. Her head tilted slightly, like a predator detecting an unfamiliar scent on the wind. The cynical, world-weary dismissal in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, penetrating curiosity. This was a new variable in her carefully balanced equation of survival. "The source," she repeated, the words flat. "You mean the prophet? That salt-rotted bastard Silas?" "Him. The nest. Whatever is down there, growing. I need to get to the epicenter." Morrow began to circle him slowly, her worn boots scuffing quietly on the grime. She was assessing him now, not as a client, but as a piece of unstable, dangerous equipment. She saw the tremor in his hand, the feverish glint in his eyes that wasn't just ambition. "You want to go talk to God?" she asked, her lip curling. The question was a test, a final probe into the depths of his particular madness. Joric didn't flinch. The image of his daughter's face, serene and smiling as she dissolved into fungal light, gave him a terrible, unshakable clarity. "No," he said, the words coming out as a near whisper, cold and absolute. "I want to prove it isn't." That was it, the missing piece of the puzzle, the truth that was stranger than any lie he could have concocted. He wasn't a fanatic. He was the opposite, an anti-prophet on a pilgrimage of destruction. The sheer, magnificent audacity of it hung in the air between them. Morrow stopped circling. She stood before him, arms crossed. A decision had been made. The cows get transferred now, not in escrow, in my account. Joric nodded, his finger tapping the screen of his interface. The transfer was instant. "We go in my rig, my route. I give an order, you follow it. No questions. You hesitate, you even flinch when I say move, I leave you for the bloom." Her voice was like forged steel. "And you bring nothing from the Aerie, no trackers, no BCA tech. You wear what I give you, you eat what I give you. Understood?" "Understood," Joric breathed, a wave of dizzying relief washing over him. She stared at him for a second longer, then turned and picked up a heavy-looking rebreather unit from a workbench, tossing it at his chest. He fumbled, catching it. It was cold, heavy, and smelled of ozone and recycled air. "Good," Morrow said, pulling her welding mask back down over her face. "We leave in an hour. Try not to die before we get to the elevator." The air in Morrow's workshop was a thick soup of competing stenches. Ozone from a sputtering arc welder, the sharp tang of industrial solvent, and underneath it all, the sweet, fungal rot of the city's slow decay. It was a smell Joric knew he would never get used to. He stood shivering, not from cold, but from the last dregs of adrenaline bleeding out of him, leaving a hollow ache where panic had been. In the corner, huddled under a scavenged thermal blanket that smelled of damp metal, Ilara was a small, silent knot of trauma. Her eyes were wide and fixed on the opposite wall, seeing not the racks of salvaged tools, but the cleansing flame that had consumed Dr. Thorne. Morrow worked without looking at him. The rhythmic scrape of a carbon file against pitted steel was the only sound besides the constant, metronomic drip of water somewhere in the shadows and the deep bass groan of the city's heartbeat. She was servicing the seals on a rebreather unit, her movements economical and precise. She hadn't offered condolences or asked questions. She had simply led them through a maze of dripping service tunnels to this metal womb hidden behind a false section of bulkhead and gotten to work. Finally, the scraping stopped. She set the file down with a soft click. "You want to go into the deeps," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Joric's voice was a raw croak. He cleared his throat. "To the source, the heart of it." Morrow turned, her face illuminated by the harsh orange glow of a single emergency lamp. Her eyes, narrowed in the gloom, seemed to appraise his very soul, weighing his desperation against his utility. "The heart of the bloom is a fairy tale, theologian. A story sump divers tell to scare the new blood. What's down there is pressure, poison, and things that used to be human." Thorne believed it was real, a central nexus. Joric clutched the single data slate he'd managed to save, its cold, sharp corners digging into his palm. It was all that was left of the man. This is his research, his life's work. I have to get it there. You have to, she repeated, a ghost of a mocking smile on her lips. I'm sure the Bloomed will be very impressed. She wiped her greasy hands on an equally greasy rag. This isn't a pilgrimage, Cantor. It's a dive, the most dangerous one possible, and it's going to cost you. I'll pay whatever you want. Good, because I want everything. She gestured with her chin towards the slate. That, and whatever Kal-El chits you have left on your wrist interface. Up front. He didn't hesitate. The city above was a war zone. Kaelen's broadcast of Thorne's execution would have ignited the Gill-Racks. His identity, his credentials, his life in the Aerie, it was all ash, just like the lab. The calibrated leaders on his interface were useless numbers now. He held out the slate. It's encrypted, heavily.
I have time, Murrow said, taking it from him. She didn't even glance at it, just tossed it onto her workbench. She then held up her own interface. Joric transferred his entire balance without a word. The confirmation chime sounded unnervingly loud in the quiet workshop.
There, Joric said. Now you listen, she cut him off, her voice hard as forged steel. My gear, my route, my rules. You speak when I tell you to. You breathe when I tell you to. You do exactly as I say, or I will cut your line and leave you to become another pretty glowing piece of coral. The girl, too. Understand? Joric looked over at Ilara, who flinched as if the words themselves were blows. He felt a surge of something cold and sharp, not anger, resignation. This was his penance. Understood. Strip, she commanded, turning back to a locker fashioned from a repurposed filtration unit. Everything. That Aerie spun fabric will rot off you in an hour down there. The next 30 minutes were a systematic erasure of Joric Cantor, forensic theologian. Off came the fine, moisture-wicking clothes of a pure. On went a clammy, patched undersuit that smelled of recycled sweat and preservatives. Moreau moved around him like a master fitting a shroud, her touch impersonal and efficient. A weighted harness, heavy and stiff, settled over his shoulders. Thick, mag-locked boots that clanked against the gritted floor. Gauntlets with scarred knuckles. She held up a rebreather mask, its faceplate scoured and hazy. This is your new god. It gives you air. You check its seals every time we stop. You monitor its levels constantly. You do not take it off, not for a second. The spore count in the deeps isn't just high, it's structural. You breathe that air unfiltered, your brain will dissolve into a hymn before your body hits the silt. He took the mask. As she cinched the final straps of the harness, he caught his reflection in a shard of mirror wedged into the wall. The man looking back wasn't him. Not anymore. The sharp, academic lines of his face were lost in shadow, framed by the grimy seals of the suit's collar. His eyes were wide, haunted. He looked like one of the some tainted he used to study with such clinical detachment, a specimen, a creature of the damp and the dark. The transformation was complete. He had spent his life chasing pathogens to prove they weren't gods, and now he was wearing the skin of the damned to descend into their cathedral. When he was fully encased, Moreau gave a single, sharp nod of approval. She then turned to Ilara, holding out a smaller, child-sized rebreather. It was cleaner than his, the faceplate less scratched. Ilara recoiled, pressing herself deeper into the corner. "It's okay," Joric said, his voice muffled by the suit's collar. He knelt,
the heavy gear groaning in protest. "It's just to help you breathe, like a game." Her gaze flickered to him, then to Morrow, then back to the mask. Slowly, trembling, she reached out and allowed Morrow to fit the device over her small face. The hiss of the seal was the only sound she made. Morrow straightened up. Ready. She walked to the center of the workshop floor, to a large circular plate of rusted iron bolted into the decking. A pressure hatch. Joric's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the steady, low thrum of the city's pumps. This was it, the precipice. Morrow grabbed a long iron pry bar and fitted it into a recess in the hatch. With a grunt of effort, she put her entire weight into it. Metal screamed against metal, a long, groaning shriek that vibrated through Joric's heavy boots. The sound of a tomb being opened for the first time in an age. With a final, shuddering clang, the locking bars disengaged. A foul, cloying gust of air washed up from the seal, thick with the scent of honey and deep rot, the pure, undiluted perfume of the Murmuration. Morrow heaved the heavy plate open. There was no ladder. Below was only blackness, a perfect, absolute void that swallowed the workshop's orange light. From its depths, a new sound echoed up, the lonely, hollow drip of water falling a very, very long way. And in that impossible darkness, something shimmered, faint, distant, and utterly alien. A greasy blue and sickly green constellation of ethereal light, the Bloom Deeps. Morrow clipped a heavy cable to a ring beside the hatch, then another to her own harness. She handed a third carabiner to Joric. "Clip in," she said, her voice flat. "Stay behind me, and try not to think about the fall."